Welcome to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz. This episode we're going to be talking about challenges to Missouri agriculture. And I have a guest with me who has been doing some farming for quite a bit. His name is Roger Allison. And Roger, you're founder of the Missouri Rural Crisis Center, aren't you?
I am. 31 years ago.
31 years ago. What does the Missouri Rural Crisis Center do?
Well, we do a number of things. We've got over 5,000 farmers and rural people that are members of the Missouri Rural Crisis Center.
And they're not in downtown St. Louis or downtown Kansas City, are they?
No, there could be some, in Kansas City and St. Louis, and we have, some membership in Columbia, but primarily it's farmers and rural people. And that we work on state and federal policy issues that impact farmers and rural people. We work on health care. We've pushed for the expansion of Medicaid for, at least 3 to 4 years.
And there's a lot of farmers who've been really impoverished and need that Medicaid, aren't there?
Absolutely. When farmers have, a problem, of illness or sickness, and, it could mean a family farm because most of them don't have, good insurance that will cover all of it. And that with the Medicaid situation, as we've got a number of rural hospitals that have closed or are potentially closing in rural Missouri, and that money would really help out, and give us more services. We also work on local control issues in rural areas. Local control is a big issue if you've got a factory farm coming to town. Or
what do you mean by factory farm?
Well, normally, farmers used to raise hogs. They'd have a couple hundred sows.
That's my uncles. That's exactly what they had.
But now, like for example, on 25 acres, they're getting ready to put 10,000 sows owned by a corporation
called CAFOs,
confined animal feeding operations. And that, these hogs aren't even owned by the farmer that's going to be taking care of them. And so...
he's sort of like a serf, isn't he?
They invest money, they build the building, and that, but essentially, they're hog house janitors.
Right.
And that, and if, the price of hogs go down, the amount of money that they get goes down. So you have these confined animal feeding operations that farmers are a part of the process, and they lose out. They make the investment, and then the corporation, if you cannot retool or put in a new ventilation system, a new feeding system, you'll lose your contract.
Wow.
But what it does in these rural areas is that it, the air is unbreathable. I mean, it isn't just like a little bit of manure. We're used to that.
Yeah, it's really, really bad when you have 10,000.
But it's concentrated in that groundwaters have been contaminated, and that communities have been torn apart by these huge operations coming in. And primarily, the ones that are going ahead and leading the charge, are the very farmers in those areas, and we help them do that.
Okay, tell me just a little bit about the farm that you have. What do you raise?
My wife, Rhonda, and I, we've got a little over 800 acres, and we've got 80 cows, 2 horses, 6 cats, and 2 dogs. And we raise some row crop, corn, soybeans, wheat, hay, and pasture.
So you sell variety. Okay.
It's a diversified farm, and we've never ever, raised any genetically modified crops.
Oh, that's great.
On our farm because, we think that it's wrong, where a company like Monsanto can, and there's other vertical integrators out there, control all the seed now.
You mentioned to me something when we were talking called public variety seeds, and I'm not familiar with that term. What is public?
Now, those are seeds that the land-grant colleges, through crossing, one good plant with another good plant, have come up with better plants, and then they've crossed plants and made hybrid plants. And so, and taxpayers have paid for that. And
for
so
the development of those seeds.
So those seeds, are public seed. And so that's what is called, public variety of seeds.
And so those are not the genetically modified.
They're not genetically modified, and in some cases now those seeds, that same public variety seed, will be crossbred more by another company, and then that company will claim rights to the seed, that they have made, if you want it.
Okay, so now that's connected with the idea of food sovereignty, isn't it?
Well, food sovereignty is a right for every country to be able to be food self-sufficient. And so it does have a lot to do with that, because if for example, if you're buying a bag of soybeans today, that could be $30 a bag. If you save your own seed, the value of that may be $8 to $10 a bag.
Okay.
And so then with the seeds that are genetically modified, a lot of them respond to certain type of chemicals like Roundup, and that what it ends up doing is putting a higher price, on crops that are raised that shut a number of farmers out.
Let's take a break and then finish up talking about food sovereignty in just a minute. We're going to see a small portion of the movie Greening the Revolution and be back in just a couple of minutes.
One of the reasons why hunger has increased is because we have not addressed the root causes of hunger. Hunger is caused in a country like the United States because people don't have living wage jobs.
The situation for the middle class is becoming less tolerable as a result of capitalism and the profit motive.
Nearly half the Americans who responded to a recent national survey said rising food prices have become a real hardship.
The whole field of genetic engineering of food crops, is part of the system of industrialized agriculture. And they keep trying to promote it as a way of, quote, ending hunger.
I am just a farmer out here. I was a seed corn dealer for about 10 years too. And of course, when the technology of the genetically engineered corn started hitting the market and the beans, I was the first ones out here. We were selling it, and of course then I used it also. You were supposed to end up with a healthier grain product at the end of the year. That was what we were told. And when we started feeding that crop in the fall of 2000, we were experiencing a huge reproductive problem in our hogs. These animals would appear to be pregnant. They thought they were pregnant, they acted like they were pregnant, and they basically, their bellies were full of bags of water. And this was happening to about 80% of my sow herd. In fact, I'm out of business because of it. We finally determined that it was the corn was the source of this estrogen activity that we were coming from. Contacted the company, Garsh. They came out, took some samples of the corn in the fall of 2001 and said, well, we'll investigate this and see, but we don't see how this could be a problem. And after that, they refused to take my phone calls. Well, it took probably 4 to 5 months to find one paper that was, if you will, brave enough to run this and incur the wrath of the industry. So we had phone calls from Nebraska, Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, and Missouri, from farmers experiencing the same sort of problems.
Now, if we look at the animal studies, animals fed genetically modified crops developed potentially precancerous cell growth in the digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, damaged immune system, lesions in the stomach, liver and kidneys, higher blood sugar levels, problems in the development of blood cells, inflamed kidneys, heavier livers, and twice the number of deaths compared to those that were fed non-GM.
But the general consumer does not know this. They just assume that what's coming off of the shelves are safe and pure, and it's been tested forever.
Tyrone Hayes was first hired in 1997 by a company that later became agribusiness giant Syngenta.
I was approached by the manufacturer and asked to study the effects of atrazine, the herbicide, on frogs. And after I discovered that it interfered with male development and caused males to turn into females to develop eggs, the company tried to prevent me from publishing and from discussing that work with other scientists outside of their panel. And eventually it even led to things like threats of violence. Tim Pasteur, for example, before I would give a talk, would literally threaten, whisper in my ear that he could have me lynched.
As far as the government itself, yeah, it's corporate run. I mean, and the USDA is probably the worst one. Anyone will tell you.
We have a strong relationship with all the companies that are dealing with something involving agriculture. Monsanto serves on some of our advisory committees. Oftentimes we're regulating those companies. Biotechnology is at various stages of acceptance globally. We feel it is safe.
Welcome back to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz. We are talking about challenges to Missouri agriculture with Roger Allison, who was over 30 years ago founded the Missouri Rural Crisis Center. Now, we were just talking about globalization and industrialization, how they're linked, and how they've totally changed agriculture.
One of the things that the Missouri Rural Crisis Center works on, is federal farm and food and trade policies that supports, family farmers, right, workers in the land. And that the single most important threat to farmers in this country, the United States, and farmers, independent family farmers in other countries, is the industrialization and the corporatization of agriculture. And that it comes to us through globalization, and that where you have trade policies, for example, like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, right, or which was a global trade policy, or NAFTA, which was a trade policy that, was basically this continent. And with NAFTA, you had Mexican corn farmers that raised corn. And they saw it, and it was a food crop, and they, and it was a very beneficial thing to them.
And they would grow their own corn.
And they grew their own corn. But then these corporations that buy corn from me then dumped our corn at below their cost of production on them. And so it drove those small corn farmers out of business.
And where did they go? They crossed the border to try to get work in the United States.
And so then they come over to the United States to try and, make a living.
Maybe work in a hog farm.
And many of them do work in a hog farm or a processing plant. And many of them are illegal, but we forced that upon them. Colombia, another example of where Colombia had all kinds of small dairy farmers that fed the country. And then we dropped all kinds of dry milk on them, and that it forced, those little dairy farmers out of business. And so what do they do now? Well, I imagine a number of them, you know, are growing coca leaves, you know, trying to make a living. And so globalization has allowed corporations, multinational corporations, you know, to, you know, mess around with farmers that were raising food for their country. And now these countries, you know, are reliant on the United States, Brazil, or other countries to buy their food, always at a higher cost. There was a United Nations study that did a study over numerous developing countries, and it showed that the more export that those countries had, that the more poverty was in those countries. And so,
well, of course, because people are not, they're working at the big multinational farms, and the whole idea is you save money by laying people off.
Or you're driving them out of business. I mean, when you destroy family farm type agriculture, whether it's in the United States or these other countries, you destroy those rural communities that basically are service centers for those farmers. And so there goes all of those jobs. And so then the food, instead of being consumed, you know, in the different countries, you know, is then shipped abroad.
And so that's a big part of the reason why there's migration problems everywhere in the world, that globalization is forcing farmers off the land in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and then people migrate somewhere, whether it's Europe or the United States, any country where they might find work.
That's right. And there's an argument against the Green Revolution that they talk about that had created so much food. The problem was the people in those countries weren't the beneficiary. We changed diets from rice to wheat. The United States is one of the largest growers of food products, agricultural products. And so they steal the production from family farmers in this country, and they break family farm systems down in other countries.
So what we're seeing in the United States, we're seeing a different version here from the same basic idea that people see across the globe.
Well, we're seeing it stepped up, you know, for us. And so now we've got larger and larger farms. And the question is, are we going to revisit 1980 all over again?
And what happened in 1980?
We lost 750,000 farms under Ronald Reagan because, you know, farm prices crashed. And farmers' land values crashed, machinery values crashed, and if you owed money and you couldn't pay it, you were foreclosed on. If you owed money and you could pay it, and your land value dropped, then the notes were called because you lost your equity. You know, sort of like the housing crisis that, you know, occurred you know, in 2008.
If you borrowed $2 million, but your land is now only worth $1 million, and then the bank can say, well, you don't have enough money.
And the bank calls the note. And so we're looking at a lot of terrible things, you know, that could happen down the road. But, you know, farmers are fighting back. They're coming together. We've made alliances with farmers in other countries, and that we do know what's happening to us.
Let's take a break. We'll come back to that in just a minute, but let's take a look at another segment of Greening the Revolution.
I think the easiest way to explain globalization is saying it's opening up communication in all sorts of areas. Particularly in economic globalization, the power tends to lie with the transnational corporations, even beyond oftentimes the power that lies in particular governments.
It incorporates the whole world into one economy, and that means transnational corporations like Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland, who are able to deliver food products into local economies around the world below what it costs local farmers to produce, driving millions of farmers off the land around the world into urban slums and into hunger and poverty.
Hunger and poverty are getting worse as a result of the so-called neoliberal economics, followed by the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO and big multinational corporations and the rich country governments, all of whom are kind of in cahoots promoting this economic model. no outside interference in the market is tolerated. Therefore, you cannot argue that, let's say, access to food, access to healthcare, access to education are a human right.
Fundamental problem is an economic system based on profit, corporate profit. And when you have an economic system based on corporate profit, you are ensuring that there will be a class of poor. You're ensuring that things that will be done in society will only be done if they are profitable.
What can you tell me about the free enterprise system?
That's the American way of life, so that, you know, you have prices that are, you know, like free market prices rather than being government controlled. Well, that was the beginning of our Republican. That's Alexander Hamilton's. He's the one. He did it. I knew he did it.
The agriculture that is poisoning the earth and poisoning people and killing people is 50 men's little game.
The basic mission is, as I said, to try to help developing countries to help themselves in fighting poverty.
I happen to believe that we have benefited immensely from trade. I think we will continue to benefit from trade.
The United States is the single most powerful shareholder.
You know, free trade agreements are always controversial.
دنيا تسكنها الجزائر، دنيا تسكنها عينيك، دنيا تسكنها الكذبة. مسكينة الجزائر، قلبي ضرب مني نشافك. مسكينة الجزائر، دنيا تسكنها الشر، دنيا تسكنها الليل.
Welcome back to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz. With me I have Roger Allison of the Missouri Rural Crisis Center. Okay, Roger, now tell us, before the break, you were just started to mention that Missouri farmers are working with farmers in other countries.
We've done exchanges with farmers from around the world, and Missouri farmers have gone into their countries and looked at their agriculture, and they've done the same thing here. And that, you know, we're in agreement that the family farm system of agriculture has got to survive worldwide. And for a policy issue here, I mean, we need to have a supply management program, and we need to have a reserve that if we have a bushel, you know, left over, it shouldn't be viewed as a bad thing. We should have bushels left over for bad times. But, you know, a striking example of farmers in Missouri working together with workers in Missouri and rural Missouri is the stoppage of the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
That was very critical.
Yeah, I mean,
it seems to be stopped now. We hope it doesn't
That's
arrive.
Right. We're not opposed to trade, but we need to have trade that is a fair trade, a trade that does not, you know, take our sovereignty away from us. And that was an example of a trade that, you know, would take our sovereignty, just like they took away the country of origin labeling away from, you know, producers in the state of Missouri and across the country.
Yeah, we don't have the right to label food.
Yeah, because, you know, the WTO, which is comprised of corporations, said, oh no, it's trade distorting. And so there's, you know, wonderful examples of local foods that are occurring here in St. Louis, Columbia, across the United States.
You're getting food from local farmers.
That's right, and farmers are getting a fair price, consumers are getting a good deal and good food.
Roger Allison,
and Patchwork Family Farms is part of that.
I've got to cut you off because we're getting the wrap-up sign. I want to thank you for coming to this episode of Green Time.
Thanks,
I want to
Don.
thank everybody for watching us, and be sure to tune in the same time next week.